Thank you, Eleanor, for organising today's memorial, and thank you all so much for coming. I'm so glad that Roy read from the Beatitudes, because there's one that I want to start off with in particular, as someone of the Christian faith. Jesus said, "Blessed are the peacemakers," not just those who believe in peace or who talk about peace, but those who act in ways that make the world a more peaceful place. And the word peace in English is often just seen as the absence of violence, but for Jesus and in the Hebrew tradition, what he was talking about was the concept of shalom, the presence of justice. We are called as Christians to make the world a more just place, to bring justice to the world, something that we share with our friends of the Buddhist faith and those of many other of the communities of Glasgow, the many faiths of this city, a city that has stood strong in solidarity with so many peoples across the world who've suffered like the Tibetan people have. Meaning of freedom has really come into question a lot in our part of the world with what is happening now in Ukraine, the events in America, even in the last few days, where people are being snatched off the streets without the knowledge of their lawyers or their friends or their family. But of course, when we contemplate what freedom means here, we should reflect on the fact, especially on today, on Uprising Day, that Tibet has not known freedom for more than 6 decades now, 66 years since the uprising. And in the decade preceding it, China's increasing suffocation of the Tibetan people, the Tibetan government, and their basic freedoms. The Tibetan struggle today is an acute one. We found out sadly last week that the American government has pulled all support and funding for the Tibetan government based in Dharamsala in northern India and the many essential community services that they provide, the orphanages, the schools, the cultural events. And the Tibetan government, the central Tibetan administration in exile and the parliament in exile has been a focal point for the global Tibetan struggle, ensuring that the plight of the Tibetan people, both in exile and in Tibet itself, is not forgotten. And we are proud here in Scotland to work with them and to offer them our solidarity. Today's the day that we remember all of the lives lost, the tens of thousands of Tibetans killed by the Chinese occupation during the uprising in 1959, but also the hundreds of thousands who have been killed and disappeared in the decades since. It's a day for us to remember the thousands of Tibetan children who right now have been snatched from their parents' homes and forced into residential boarding schools, the aim of which is to annihilate their culture, to make them forget their language, to erase Tibetans and the Tibetan culture and tradition and history from the land of Tibet itself. So we're here as part of the global solidarity movement in Tibet to make sure that the sacrifices of those who stood up in defense of their people, in defense of His Holiness in 1959, are not forgotten, but also to ensure that the struggle that has gone on for almost 7 decades since and that continues today is not forgotten. So thank you all very much for coming today. We will now lay these flowers in remembrance of all those Tibetans who've lost their lives through this struggle.